Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laura Wegman, and I'm a junior here at Hillsdale College. I am double majoring in American Studies and Fine Art, and it is my distinct privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. Forbes. Stephen Forbes is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Forbes Media, as well as Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Magazine. A graduate of Princeton University, President Reagan named Mr. Forbes chairman of the Board for International Broadcasting in 1985, in which position he oversaw the operation of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. He campaigned for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1996 and 2000. He serves on the boards of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's on the board of overseers of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, on the board of visitors for the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. His books include Flat Tax Revolution, Using a Postcard to Abolish the IRS, and How Capitalism Will Save Us, Why Free People and Free Markets Are the Best Answers in Today's Economy, co-authored with Elizabeth Ames. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Forbes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much, Laura, and thank all of you for a very warm welcome. It is good to be back at Hillsdale, which sometimes in these turbulent times feels like what a monastery must have felt like during the Dark Ages, place of enlightenment. But it is, and also I was also delighted to get a free dinner, not quite the same as a free lunch, but you take what you can. But I've been asked tonight to make some remarks about the Great Society and where we're at today and where we go from here with that legacy. As you learned earlier from Jonah, where the Great Society, and he hit on the early 60s, the Great Society really should be called the Great Hubris. It's true. There was really a feeling in that time that man and government could solve every problem, remove every risk, banish every woe, as long as you had the experts running things. And it was sort of a combining, in a perverse way, American can-doism with the power of big government. But as the founders could have told them, that is not a good formula. But nonetheless, they thought they could create a utopia. And some of you, I don't think any of you are old enough, I'm old enough to remember back in the 60s when we put a man, that's, yes, it's called pandering. I tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why I'm here tonight. But back in the 60s, with the Apollo program, getting a man on the moon, I can't tell you how many times you heard the phrase, if we can put a man on the moon, we can clear the slums. That's what they called the inner city in those days. If we can put a man on the moon, we can have everyone employed. We can do this, we can do that. So it was part of the era. And even in warfare, the early part of the Vietnam War, when they're escalating the war, McNamara, the defense secretary, was really into numbers, wonkism, gave wonkism a bad name if they had the name then. And he really felt that if you scientifically increase the pressure on North Vietnam, they would cave. And so this wasn't done on how you fight insurgencies. This wasn't done to meet the peculiarities or particularities of that particular region, which in 2006 we finally started to do in Iraq, which is why we won there after nearly losing it. That was not done in the late 1960s. So in warfare, they thought they could apply this kind of quantitative approach. Getting rid of slums, as they call it in the inner cities, which urban renewal, which became known as urban removal. And you saw what happened with so-called public housing. Turned out to be disasters because they weren't natural. But the wonderful phrases they use, like acres in the sky, houses in the sky, really giddy stuff, but disasters. They all thought they could save the developing world by applying more money, more so-called American know-how. Some of you may remember the early 60s when John Kennedy came in, the Alliance for Progress was going to save Latin America. It didn't. But they thought they could eradicate disease, hence the war on cancer, eradicate poverty, hence the war on poverty. Soviet Union even, there was a period of time where they had the thing called convergence, that we're going to become more big government, they're going to become less big government. They actually believed this stuff in those days. So it was sort of an early version of the end of history. And the economy, they thought that they could get rid of ups and downs in the economy, eradicate them. They thought they could tame the business cycle. They thought that free markets were inherently unstable, that if you didn't have a strong government guiding the thing, free markets would go off the rails as it did allegedly in the Great Depression. So government would be like an automobile. You would step on the pedal if things were getting too slow, put on the brakes when things were getting too hot, as if they knew whether the economy, you hear the phrase today, overheating or underperforming. And so Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, actually thought how blissful it would be if economic policy was set by a group of wise men. This was before women got more power, but he called it wise men. And just make that clear. I have 5 daughters, so I've got to be careful on these things. But he really thought that you could have an environment where a handful of people who knew more than everybody else could guide in a very precise and scientific way the economy and make sure it stayed on an even keel. And he disdained gold, as a barbarous relic. Who needs that? People with the right facts can deal with the money. And you saw it too in monetarism. There was the feeling that monetarism, you control the money supply, you can eradicate the business cycle. And in that sense, and I'm being blunt here, Keynesianism and monetarism at that time was really 2 sides of the same coin. So it was when they're sort of a scientific version of Philosopher Kings. They could do it better than messiness of politics and free markets. As you know, the progressive era in this country thought that government had become inefficient, that the checks and balances of the Constitution were antique and archaic and standing in the way of progress. So if you had experts using scientific methods above the political fray, they could bring about heaven on earth. There was another aspect in how this came about. It wasn't just ideas suddenly taking over. This is something that both liberals and conservatives are a little bit squirmish about, and that is warfare. As you know from history, major wars bring about big increases in government power. That's why you got the absolute monarchies in France and Spain. That's why you didn't get it in Britain, because they were not part of the continent. So they had a small military, big navy, but small military. In this country, we had a tradition, a very, very small national government, deliberately designed. For most of the 19th century, the only time you'd have a run-in with the federal government was at the post office. And the major exception, of course, was the Civil War, massive increase in government powers. But after the Civil War, income tax eventually eradicated, government powers ramped down. And then World War I, enormous increase in government power. But after World War I, the tradition hit again in the 1920s. Government spending was slashed. Taxes were slashed from wartime rates. Income tax was cut from a high of 77% down to 25%. Actual government spending was reduced from what it was at the beginning of that decade. And the national debt was reduced by over 1/3, particularly under the push of Calvin Coolidge, whose reputation is now going up. But what happened? Why in the world do we have the Leviathan that we have today? Well, first came the Great Depression and the activist President Herbert Hoover. As you know, the myth is that he was a do-nothing president. Actually, he was a do-too-much president. It was the Smoot-Hawley tariff that helped initially bring on that disaster. If you follow the course of that legislation in 1929, 1930, every time that legislation looked like it might pass, putting on massive tax increases on imports, every time it looked like it might pass, the stock market crashed, especially in the fall of 1929, when it looked like it might be sidetracked in the sausage factory of Congress. Stock market came up. By the end of 1929, many stocks were at the same level as they were at the beginning of 29. Then Smoot-Hawley came back again, and the rest destroyed the global trading system, destroyed then the flow of global capital, massive trade war, global depression. How did Hoover respond to this? He told big companies, don't cut your wages. That sounds like a nice thing. Amazingly, they agreed to it and didn't for over a year. But how did they cope when their sales plummeted? Why, they put the pressure on their suppliers, and the suppliers took the hit. It didn't work. As if all of that wasn't enough, in 1931, Hoover concluded that the budget was an imbalance. No surprise when you have a depression. Government receipts plummet. He thought he could restore confidence by putting in a huge tax increase and restoring confidence. Congress amazingly went along, and so unemployment went from 15% to 25%. They raised the top income tax rate from 25% to 63%. They put on excise taxes everywhere, including a stamp tax. You thought we didn't have stamp taxes after the Revolutionary period, pre-Revolutionary War. They came back on checks. You wrote a check, you paid a fee, a government tax. So guess what happened? Since why pay a government tax writing a check? People withdrew cash from the banks, and that put more pressure on an already weakened banking system. So Hoover brought it on, but nonetheless was declared to be a massive failure of free markets. And so you had a full disaster there, which meant when Hoover brought on more power, Roosevelt comes in with a New Deal, massive increase in federal power in peacetime. The people especially came in with Roosevelt were intoxicated by the power they had briefly in World War I. After all, in a world war, you have to mobilize all resources. Government took over the post office, took over the telephone companies, huge increase. And as I mentioned, after the war, it was ramped down, but that experience led a lot of people to think, by golly, if we could win a war by having a massive central government, by golly, think of all the glorious things we can do in peacetime. And so when the New Deal came in, we had the closest thing to the F word that was discussed earlier, with a liberal in front of it, Jonah's book, in terms of the corporate state with the NRA, National Recovery Administration, where you had codes of conduct for businesses. You were told what you could pay, told the price you could charge, and you went to jail if you violated those codes, including numerous stories. Amity Schleys recounts some of them, of a tailor charging for what it cost to clean and press a shirt, went to jail for it because he wasn't charging enough. Thankfully, the Supreme Court, in one of its last great acts, threw it out in 1935. Roosevelt browbeat the courts, and as a result, even though he couldn't pack the courts, it's only now that for the first time, I think, the courts, in terms of the economic area, is finally going to go back to the Constitution. Because since the 1930s, even when they sort of knew the government wasn't doing things that it shouldn't be doing things that it was doing, they backed off from it. An example was, of course, GM and Chrysler, especially in the case of Chrysler in early 2009, tearing up contracts like that. That should have been taken on by the courts and declared unconstitutional, declared illegal. They took a pass on it. But I think with this individual mandate from Obamacare, that is getting a serious look that would not have happened a year or two ago. So things are thankfully beginning to move back. But in terms of power, the power then by the end of the 1930s, the New Deal had been discredited. They'd taken a huge hit in the 1938 elections. Roosevelt was repudiated even by his own party when he tried to purge members who weren't going along with his program. He lost most of those primaries. Then, of course, came the Second World War. Huge ramp up in power, absolutely necessary to preserve ourselves in civilization. So what happened after World War II? Power declined again. Big cuts in government spending, despite the best efforts of Harry Truman. Taxes were cut. Excise taxes especially were cut. Even the income tax was cut a little bit. Wartime controls were removed. Economists thought too precipitously, but by golly, they were removed. And what happened? Did we have a depression? No. The economy got better. 10 million veterans, 12 million veterans come back. Economy absorbs them. Unemployment never approached 6% until 1949. So, looked like we were going to get back on track again after the Great Depression, the experience of the Second World War. And then, of course, came the Cold War. Another mammoth increase in government to fight that thing. And then war became a motif. Hence, the war on poverty. Hence, the war on disease, war on cancer, war on drugs. Even the National Highway Program, Interstate Highway Program in the 1950s was justified in terms of national security. So the government grew again, and it became, even after the end of the Cold War, no one had the appetite to really ramp the thing back. Ronald Reagan helped end the Cold War. If it hadn't been for him, we would not have won the Cold War the way we did, but he was out of office. when that thing was finally achieved, and those who succeeded him did not have his desire to reduce the size of the Leviathan. So, but if you look back at the Great Society, the Great Hubris, look where we are today. In terms of the Great Society, it's hard to pinpoint anything that it did ultimately really right, other than the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in early 1965. Almost everything else was a failure. On the economic side, the 1970s, after we got rid of the gold standard under Republican Richard Nixon, finally killed the thing, but the intellectual thinking was all against gold, have floating rates and the like, had a terrible decade of inflation, massive unemployment. As you know, by the early 1980s, before Reagan's reform programs kicked in, unemployment was higher than even it is today. 21% interest rates, 18% mortgage rates. The stock market in real terms down 60% from what it was 15 years before. You bellyache about the market today. Imagine a 15-year bear market. Had plenty of rallies in between. But in real terms, economists call the trend line a disaster. So, poverty. Do we get rid of poverty? No. In fact, what happened? You got poverty groups created, groups funded by the government to help poor people. And it was amazing. Groups like ACORN is the most notorious one, but there's scores of those groups out there. Imagine using government money to lobby the government for more power, more regulations, and more money. Talk about the ultimate perpetual motion machine. This is it. We give you money, you can use it to lobby for more money. Whoa. And so, what no surprise, welfare exploded. They thought it was humane to put people on welfare, blighted millions of lives, encouraged family breakdown, crime, drug use went up. In terms of the economy itself, the ups and downs became more violent, not less violent. And what happened? In terms of the economy was so weak by the end of the 1970s, before Reagan came in, that people thought, as some do today, the United States was in an irreversible decline. And so it's not just economics, not just material prosperity. When the United States is perceived as weak, bad things happen in the rest of the world. And we're still paying the price. You look at Iran, some other things, still paying the price for it today. So Reagan's reforms come in. We have a 20-year-plus boom. He reduced tax rates, killed the terrible inflation of the 1970s, won the Cold War, deregulation. It started under Jimmy Carter, but he really pushed it, Ronald Reagan. Take airlines. Today, you may pay $100, $200 for a ticket to go somewhere. Equivalent to 30 years ago would have been $1,000 to $2,000. They didn't complete it, which is why you have all of this backup at airports, because the air traffic control was not deregulated. So we're still using obsolete technology there. If technology was up to date in air traffic control, it could handle 2 to 3 times the amount of airline traffic that it does today. So the job wasn't complete. But in railroads, they did a good job of deregulation. Railroads were going bust in the 70s, going bankrupt. Government had to take over Conrail, the old Pennsylvania Railroad. When it was deregulated in the early 80s, gave them flexibility to charge what they wanted, to merge how they wanted. Railroads revived. They're booming today. And as a result, today the United States, in terms of moving freight, has the most efficient system in the world. Now, people say, why don't we do more for moving passengers by rail? The thing is, when you have a rail system, it can do one of 2 things. It can move passengers or freight. It cannot do both. The track that can handle freight efficiently is not good for high-speed rails. You have one or the other. If you want to move passengers, you have to build a whole rail system, which costs tens of billions of dollars. And even in Europe, which they've been pushing this for decades, only 6% of European passenger traffic is moved by rails, despite massive subsidies and efforts to get people off the roads. It just does not work in a modern economy. In high-density areas, like parts of the East Coast, it does work, but in much of the country, it manifestly does not work. But the thing is, though, for the rare times in history, government agencies cease to exist. The Civil Aeronautics Board, the Interstate Commerce Commission, they cease to exist with these kind of deregulations. So the Great Society, the problem with the Great Society and what preceded it, that impulse, was they forgot about even their 2 successes in civil rights. Civil rights advanced in this country not because the government decreed that it must happen. It happened because citizens, people like Martin Luther King Jr., changed public opinion about civil rights. So when the law was passed in 1964, it had the full assent of most of this country. Remember, the 14th and 15th Amendments had been passed after the Civil War. Read them. Boy, that's great stuff. But they were dead letters because public opinion was not supportive of it. So it was the groundwork laid by the civil rights movement, groundwork laid by men like Martin Luther King Jr., that made it possible for not only those bills to pass, but to become effective and have the moral assent of the people. Just give you one quick example on that, because this is so important when courts start to think they're philosopher kings. If you watch a movie called Giant, if you're up late and you have Netflix and want to watch something, you remember the scene where they go to the restaurant after a party or something, and he has, I think, the Hispanic fellow with him, and they go in the restaurant, and the restaurateur in Texas says, "Get these, you know what's out of here." The guy gets in a fight. By 1964, when public accommodations, it was decreed by federal law that if you serve the public, you must serve all of the public. You didn't have that kind of violent resistance. You had some resistance, Georgia and elsewhere, but given the mood of the people 10 years before, what was remarkable is how well that part of the Civil Rights Act worked. But it wasn't a decree from the government. It was because it had the moral assent of the people. People knew this was the right thing to do and willing to have it enforced, which was not true a generation before. So it wasn't decrees from folks on high. It was groundwork, scut work done day after day by civil rights leaders that prepared the groundwork for what happened. Unfortunately, the wrong lessons were learned. So the Supreme Court in the early 70s decides to be philosopher king and ban abortion in this country. I mean, allow abortion. Now, put aside what you feel about abortion. That is a subject that should be ultimately decided by we, the people. And in the early 1970s, as I'm pro-life, it pains me to say this, but public opinion was in favor of beginning to expand the rights to abortion. You saw it in California, you saw it in New York, you started to see it in other states. So we might have gone the way of Western Europe. In the early part of a pregnancy, you could do it. And it would have happened. You may not have liked it. I wouldn't have liked it. But it happened in the way that it should happen, with the consent of the people. And those who, when you lose a battle, the nice thing is in a democracy, you can revisit those battles. But if it comes from a decree from the court, it poisons politics. It pollutes politics, which is why these Supreme Court fights are so fierce and nasty and vicious, because so much rides on things that should be settled by legislatures, by we the people, instead of unelected judges. So that is an unfortunate legacy of that period. You can decree things and good things will happen. In essence, what the Great Society and what this government today has forgotten, or at least two parts of it have forgotten, is that government is human beings, people. And people means politics. People have emotions. People have interests. And government has interests. The one great advantage that government has is that it seems to be judged by intentions, while in the private sector, you're judged by results. So the government can muck up, as it did for welfare for decades, education, as it's done still today, but hey, the intentions are good, so you get a pass. Let's judge them by results and realize big government is not some wonderful thing. It is people, and it has its own special interests. For example, education. K through 12 in many parts of the country, we're not keeping up with the rest of the world. And yet, even though the results are bad, even though a lot of teachers who are teaching shouldn't be teaching, try to make a change. It is fiercely resisted. And you get little pockets of change. One example is New Orleans. After Katrina, government took over the schools because wiped out. But after Katrina, something happened in Louisiana, amazingly positive. And that is, the government allowed most of those schools to become charter schools. So each school could run the school in its own way. As a result, Even though 84% of the kids in New Orleans schools are from low-income families, test scores are going up. If you're a parent and don't like what the school is doing, you're not restricted by neighborhood. You can send the kid to another school. Voila, it works. The KIPP schools, read about them. Village academies, I'm familiar with them in Harlem. Take kids starting in the 5th grade. They don't cherry pick them. They come, well, those who want to come can come, but the school doesn't go out and try to pick the most promising students. Test scores zoomed in an environment where learning is taken seriously. Even if the kid comes from a household that is not conducive to learning, it can happen in a properly functioning school. I mentioned welfare. Blighted tens of millions of lives, manifestly not working. It wasn't until 1996 that it came to pass, and that was from relentless pressure from a Republican Congress and the experiment, which is what should happen in a federal kind of government arrangement. States can do things and see what works and doesn't work. Wisconsin led the charge in the early 80s on welfare reform, showed you could drastically cut welfare rolls and not have people starve to death. People could learn and get into the workforce. And so Wisconsin did it. Others did it. Even New York City, under Mayor Rudy Giuliani. When he came into office, 1.1 million people on welfare rolls. The time he left was about 400,000 or 500,000. And New York was not a blighted place. It prospered. A lot of those folks went to work for the hospitality industry. Why were people suddenly need for hospitality workers in hotels? Because you fought crime. Reduced crime, New York became a nice place to visit. Times Square became a place where you could walk from one end to another and come out alive. It's amazing. It's amazing. So, but government does not respond the way a business does in the marketplace. If a business is not doing something to meet the needs and wants of others, if it's not providing a product or service that others want, guess what happens? It fails. Government, the force of the government power, they can go on forever, as we saw with welfare. And you see it today. These independent agencies, which are of dubious constitutional value, I'm not sure in the previous times they would have been passed muster, but they have numerous independent agencies. And the Congress loved these things because they could write laws in vague language, throw them off to these independent agencies. When something went wrong, they could say, oh, those darn bureaucrats, it's their fault. I can't do anything about it. Vote for me. And so it's shucking off of responsibility. And once you have an agency, it will fight to exist. That's human nature. Even if the need for it has ceased to exist, it'll fight to exist. And you see numerous examples. Federal Communications Commission, been told by the courts, leave the internet alone. It's not the same as telephone service. Yet what did it do over Christmas? Put its claws into the internet. Federal Trade Commission about to do the same thing. You see it on the state level. 50 public utility commissions having regulations on wire lines. Now they're trying to find a way to do wireless, which is preposterous. But they're not going to give it up. They're not going to give it up. So bottom line is, government agencies, governments are special interests like anybody else. They're human beings like anyone else. And unlike the free markets, they don't have the instant feedback and have to respond to the instant feedback of people's preferences. The bottom line is, in terms of the economy, in terms of the need for Philosopher Kings, the bottom line is, which you never would have heard during the Great Society years, and you certainly wouldn't hear it from the White House today, is that every economic disaster in the past 100 years and even before has as its origins not some sudden failure of free markets, but massive government mistakes. Great Depression, Smoot-Hawley, numerous regulations, huge tax increases, New Deal. Why was that the first time in American history, in a recovery, we didn't reach the peak that we did before the Depression? Never happened before or since because of the failures of the New Deal, massive government intervention in the economy. Mamady Schlaze and others, Jim Powell and others have chronicled the thing. 1970s, huge inflation, seen as a failure of democracy, seen as a failure of free enterprise. No, was the Fed printing too much money and other central banks following that bad example, cutting the tide of gold? Bad things happen. Government increases its powers, at least for a while. And today, the disaster we're trying to recover from today, don't fall for the thing, oh, greedy Wall Street bankers. Blaming greed for this disaster is like blaming gravity for airplane crashes. Not very helpful in particular cases, not very helpful. In this case, take the Federal Reserve. Printed too much money, still printing too much money. You could not have had a housing bubble if the Fed hadn't printed so much money. Could not have happened. Fannie and Freddie guaranteeing $1.5 trillion of junk paper. Government entities and other things, which I won't bore you with, like mark-to-market accounting, how it was applied, brought on this disaster. So yes, Wall Street, a lot of bad things happened. The bottom line is, if government does its part right, free markets with sensible rules of the road will do its part right. And remember this, people are imperfect. James Madison was right. If we are angels, we would not need laws. We would not need government. Manifestly, we're not angels, except for perhaps grandchildren, maybe up to a certain age. So today, what you see in Washington is what is truly the last stand of statism in this country, which started really in the 1930s in peacetime. The reason I say it is look at that State of the Union address. On paper, the president looked like he was moving to the center. What does that tell you? Did Ronald Reagan, to advance his principles, his programs, his policies, have to use ultra-left liberal language? Why does this guy suddenly feel he has to use semi-conservative centrist language? Because he knows the American people aren't on the same page as he is. He is a statist. Even that State of the Union address, I'm surprised, well, maybe it's because it happened in January. If you'd given that in December, he would have gotten a nomination for Oscar for Best Actor. Because, seriously, when you start to parse that thing, he talks about the crazy salmon regulation at the same time that his agencies are still pushing ahead with massive regulation. He talks about the need for tax simplification, but yes, says we got to raise taxes on the rich. Well, that's not tax simplification. So you go through the thing. Even in Afghanistan, he praises our troops in a way that Ronald Reagan would have loved, but then says, well, we're going to start withdrawing troops in July. What does that tell to your enemies? You can wait us out. You can wait this guy out. So the tone was one thing, Reagan-esque rhetoric, but socialist substance. And I use that word very carefully. Big battles, though, are coming. Even though the public opinion is against what is happening, it's not going to happen automatically. Fortunately, people learn from examples. One of the things that is seminal in this age is what's happened in Greece. People can see government, even if it's a relatively small one, can go off the rails and disaster can happen. And we're not immune to that either. One little factoid on Greece. If you ever had a cocktail party, among other crazy things, they have a national railway system. Revenues, carry passengers. Revenues, $130 million a year. Expenses, $900 million a year. And experts have figured that if they shut down the railway system and gave everyone free cab fare, they'd save money. So this is why it's going to take a hard work to finally get us back on the track that our founders put us, and that events of the last century manifestly have pushed us off. And that is President Obama, give him credit, in his mind, is one of the most successful presidents in the first 2 years in American history. I mentioned Roosevelt, a lot of his stuff got thrown out by the courts, but see it from the way this man sees it. By his lights, he's achieved great things in terms of having government dominate or control the economy. Socialism has always been defined as government owning the means of production, blah, blah, blah. But he's just learned long ago, and other people like him have learned, you don't have to own something to control it. If you control it by regulation, if their existence depends on your diktats, your beneficence, that's even better than nationalizing them. Because when things go wrong, you blame the health insurance company. You don't blame the man in the White House. So look what they did in health care. It's a virtual de facto takeover, coming in slow motion over the next 4 years. But already health insurance companies are learning they better band together. The government loves that because big things are easier to regulate and control. They're going to be told what they can charge, what they can offer, who gets health care, who doesn't. One of the things they put in this health care bill is destroying what they call mini-med insurance, which is health insurance, some basic stuff for low-income workers, transient workers. You remember a couple of months ago, McDonald's was leaked that McDonald's is going to have to withdraw it for 30,000 of its workers because of the crazy way they did this bill in terms of loss ratios, medical loss ratios. I won't bore you with the specifics. Well, when that hullabaloo came up, McDonald's got a waiver. What's the criteria for waiver? But only for 1 year, which means they have to come back again, keep them in check. How do they determine the waiver? It's up to them. They've issued now hundreds of waivers, mostly to unions, but that is power. They get to decide who can survive and who perishes. Something that hasn't gotten much attention, so-called financial reform bill, same thing, deliberately vague language. The industry still doesn't know what it is, but it means they get to control it without owning it. You have to go to them to determine what to do. And they say this will help fight too big to fail. No, it codifies it. Because under systemic risk, they can do anything they want. They can come and say, Larry, Hillsdale poses a systemic risk. You handle money, therefore you come under our purview. We got to take you over. Sorry, it's for the greater good. They can do that. So it's going to be all fought out in the courts, which is time, which means things become settled, and it's very hard, becomes in their minds very hard to reverse. Energy, they try to do it with this thing called cap and trade, big tax increases, control the energy industry de facto. Well, Congress didn't go along with it. And the people caught on the EPA was going to try to dictate it. So what do? People are catching on to what you're trying to do. Why you do what the President did in the State of the Union address, talk about the need for green energy. Sounds benign, green, especially money, people like green. But by 2035, he says, 80% of energy in this country must come from renewable resources, which means massive government control and regulation. Two areas where you can get really good renewable resources and do so cheaply: nuclear power. The President says, the White House says, well, they like nuclear power. Try getting all the approvals. So yes, but they make it impossible, very difficult for it to come to pass. So they block off that source. Another big one in this country is natural gas. Thanks to hydraulic fracturing, which properly done means massive increases in the production of natural gas. We're going to become the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, and in 10 years we'll be exporting natural gas. That's why the price is so cheap today, down almost 70% from what it was just 2 years ago. People know this is a big thing coming, which makes it viable to have trucks use it, not by diktat from government, just because you can put in the infrastructure, know the supply is there and the price is right. So they're going to make it very difficult to do hydraulic fracturing, say it's going to poison your water wells. Well, if done wrong, yeah, it'll do it. Well, like anything, you drive wrongly, you're going to have a bloodbath, but it doesn't mean you ban cars. Figure out how to do it right. So through vague language comes power. And spending, it's not just spending. Remember on spending, this is important to tell your liberal friends, where does the money come from? It's not manna from heaven. It's not from Mars. It comes from we the people. You either tax it, borrow it, or print it, which is another form of taxation. So they love spending. Why? They say it stimulates the economy. It doesn't. So why do they still do it? Because it means power. They seize the resources to help us, but they seize the resources. You see it in terms of monetary policy, loose monetary policy, form of taxation, power. So this recovery, even though we're going to have growth this year of 3.5%, 4%, this is the worst recovery from a severe recession since the Great Depression. Why is it so punk? Yes, 2 years ago we were going 0 miles an hour. Now maybe we get up to 35, 40. We're capable on the open highway of going 65, 75. So why isn't it happening? Let's just quickly go down the list. Monetary policy. I know this is the most boring subject in the world. Federal Reserve, interest rates, dollar, blah, blah, blah. You see Ben Bernanke, nice beard, but It's unlike Larry. So monetary policy. And by the way, just to give you a tip on monetary policy, if you ever find yourself on an airplane, in coach, middle seat, on the runway, watching your life pass away, want a little bit of elbow room, talk to your seatmates about monetary policy. They'll cut you a wide slack. Now, the young people here, most of you are single. Here's another tip. On a bad date, want out, talk about monetary policy, and you'll never see that person again. But if you think of monetary policy as you would an automobile, an automobile can have a magnificent vehicle, but if you don't have sufficient fuel, you stall. Too much, you get the economic equivalent of flooding the engine. Right amount, you have a chance to move forward. Same is true with monetary policy. If you don't supply enough liquidity to meet the needs of the marketplace, the legitimate needs of the marketplace, you're going to stall the economy. If you supply too much, you get the economic equivalent of flooding the engine, which is what the Fed's been doing since the early part of the last decade. That's what's been happening. This is why the Fed trashing the dollar is so destructive. It's immoral. If you supply your labor, you get a certain amount of dollars in return, that should be a fixed amount. You should know that if you decide to not buy something right away, you can buy the equivalent tomorrow. Politicians shouldn't change the value of what you get for your labor or your investments. That's what monkeying around with the monetary, what the dollar does. Weak dollar means weak recovery. They've done revisions of our economic performance. They do this for years. You get the GDP number, that's just the beginning. They keep revising as they get more information in. Suddenly discovering in the last decade, particularly since 2004, standard of living's been stagnant in this country. Weak dollar means less productive investment, more speculation, ultimately a lower standard of living. It happened in the 70s, it's happening today. So think of it this way. Imagine if Washington did to the hour what it does to the dollar. You have 60 minutes in an hour. Tomorrow it's 48 minutes. Day after is 32. Next day is 90. Day after that is 25 minutes. You'd soon have to have hedges, derivatives, futures to figure out how many hours you're working. Supposed to go to a lecture today. How long is the lecture? Well, is that our lecture in Michigan hour or Chinese hour or Japanese hour? How do you convert it from an English hour? It just makes life complicated. Keep it simple. And, if printing money was the way to wealth, Zimbabwe and Argentina would own the world today. And think of it. If printing money was the way to wealth, they should legalize counterfeiting. Let everyone do it. You have a lot of money. Wealth. That's what the Fed is doing. It's a form of legalized counterfeiting. This is what's so important. I don't want to bore you totally on monetary policy, but the thing to remember is money comes from people doing things with one another, transactions with one another. It makes it easier to do. It allows you to look to the future instead of the immediate present. It allows you to create capital for investment. Think of it, 3,000 years ago, if I sold a page in Forbes Magazine, what would I get paid in? Maybe a herd of goats, some sheep, maybe a camel or two. Then I have to figure out how do I turn these goats and barter enough goats to get PCs for our writers. It just makes it very complicated. Money makes it easier. It does wonderful things if done right. So, bottom line on money, I'll make this prediction. Because of what we're going through now, in the next 5 years, we're going to have something that we haven't had since the early 70s. The dollar's going to be retied to GOLD. It has to happen. Cannot trust human beings to determine the value of money. We, the people, determine the value of the money, not Washington politicians. So in terms of monetary policy, it's holding us back. Taxes, you know the catechism on that. Taxes just don't raise revenue for the government. They're also a price and a burden. Tax you pay on income, price you pay for working. Tax on profit, price you pay for being successful. Tax on capital gains, the price you pay for taking risks that work out. And the proposition's a very simple one. When you lower the price of good things like productive work, risk-taking, success, get more of them. Raise the price, you get less of them. So this talk of tax increases, very, very destructive and complicated. Why do we have a complicated code? Because it's power. You want something done, you got to go to Washington, get an exemption, or try to shaft your competitors with something. It's a form of power. That's why the code's been amended 14,000 times in the last 25 years. You know, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 272 words, defined the character of the American nation. Declaration of Independence, about 1,500 words. Constitution, with all the amendments, 7,200 words. The Bible, centuries to put together, 773,000 words. Federal Income Tax Code, all its attendant rules and regulations, 9.5 million words and rising. Nobody knows what's in it. You don't have to go to the Amazon to find, you know, if you have a wintry night here, just to go through the code, you'll, whoa. And it's a source of power. It's a source of power, huge source of power. And so, you know, several years ago, Money Magazine did a survey, took a hypothetical family's finances, gave the numbers to 46 different tax preparers, asked them to prepare the return. You know what they got back? 46 different returns, 46 different estimates of what the family owed. Thousands of dollars difference. The experts don't know. They make their living at it. So I'll make another prediction. In the next 5 years, you're starting to see it already. When this president talks about tax simplification, you know something is stirring. It's got to be done right. I'm afraid that his version is the old IRS version. Line 1, what did you make? Line 2, send it in. No, that's not what we mean. It's not what we mean by tax simplification. I think we should do a simple flat tax, single rate, 17%. Generous exemption for adults and for kids, family of 4, no federal income tax on your first $46,000 of income, only 17% above that. No tax on savings, no death tax. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. As our founders would say, no taxation without respiration. So you can see what the good things can come. And on spending, people get it now, where the money comes from and what it can lead to. So, bottom line is, on regulations, what you see is for the first time in decades, they're starting to look at the Constitution about these independent agencies and regulations. And the first step will be to pass a law that any regulation that has an economic consequence of more than $100 million has to be approved by Congress. No more hiding. You're going to be held responsible. Openness if you want to do this to the American people. That'll just be for starters. Let me just close by talking about entitlements. Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, you know what's happened there. Social Security, disaster, $12 trillion of unfunded liabilities, depending on your assumptions. Medicare, Medicaid, $40 to $80 trillion. You look at those numbers, you look at the rise in the government debt, you just might as well slit your wrist. But here's what's going to happen if we make it happen. If we start to get things right, such as the dollar, such as a tax code that does not get in our way, such as regulation, curbing that, what's going to happen is this. The balance sheet is going to come to our rescue. When you start to do a few things right, what happens? You start to get more growth, which means more incomes, which means more opportunity, means more government revenue. What does that do? It raises the value of assets. When people start to see a future again, present value of assets go up. So you take America today, if you add up all the things you own, cars, houses, goldfish, stocks, bonds, bank CDs, the whole schmeal, subtract out all your liabilities, mortgages, credit card debt, personal debt, leases, American households are still plus $55 trillion, more than the rest of the world put together. Gross assets of over $70 trillion. You start to get a rise in asset value, easy to see it go up 10 or 20 trillion from that base. 20 trillion overcomes a lot of stupidity from Washington. That's what we did in the early 80s when Reagan's reforms kicked in. Now, liability side, Social Security, well, for my generation, forget it. It was not financed right, but we have enough wealth in the nation to meet those obligations. It's not going to come from the trust fund. It's a fraud. It'll come from the general budget. And the thing, if you want to reform that system, is don't tamper with those who are on the system. It's like a war debt, sunk cost. Shouldn't have done it the way we did, but we did. We can live through it. Key thing is for younger people. Put in a new system for younger people. By younger, at my age, below 55. Actually older than that, but maybe you hadn't noticed. But anyway, younger people, you can do it. System where you have your own personal accounts, financed by that payroll tax, or a big part of it. The nice thing about that is it's your property, not Washington politicians. You turn a liability into an asset. Over time, with proper rules on diversification, as you get older, more of your money has to go into short-term fixed income instruments. So if a market crashes, you don't have to worry. You're well diversified. This is very conservative, basic stuff. You start to create capital instead of destroy it. Think of it. Kid gets a part-time job in the summer. They're going to start to accumulate money, capital. What does that mean, they're going to ask? They're not going to be in a mood for politicians to start fooling around with it. It's theirs. They earned it. They created it, not a bureaucrat in Washington or a congressperson or a senator. They did it. Now, think of it. Liability into an asset. And on health care, in closing, ask yourself, why do we have a health care crisis in this country? And the answer is, well, we want more of it. Well, think of how strange that is. In any other part of the economy, if people want more of something, entrepreneurs supply it. People want more great education. Larry will tell you how to do it. Suck up, but anyway, I'm happy to make my host happy. And if people want more software or apps, plenty of writers out there in California, here and elsewhere, to supply them. People want more cars. Detroit would be very happy to supply them in this state. So what's with health care? Why is the demand seen not as an opportunity, growth industry, but, oh my God, we're going to destroy us? It's the crazy way we finance it, disconnect between providers and consumers. Think of it. We don't have real free markets in health care. We have pieces of it, which is why we still produce more new medical devices, more new medicines than the rest of the world put together. But it's only pockets of it. Think of it. We grew up with this system, so we don't realize how strange it is. You go to a doctor, hospital, clinic, and you ask in advance what it costs. Now look at you. It means one of two things. Either you're uninsured or you're a lunatic. Why would you want to know what it costs? What's it to you? It'll be like going to a restaurant, ordering a bottle of wine. Say, I don't care what it costs. That's Blue Shield's problem. Let Medicaid work that out. So the system goes off the rails. So what do? You bring more free enterprise into health care, not less. Take food. Food's more basic than health. No food, no nothing. Now, if people have trouble getting food, does that mean the government take over the farms? If it did, we'd have no more obesity. Michelle Obama would have to find something else to focus on because we'd be all starving to death. They tried it in Russia and China. Disastrous results. So in this country, we allow the farmers to grow the food. Private companies process the food. Truckers deliver it. Grocery stores, supermarkets, restaurants, others sell the food. If people have problems getting it, we have everything from food banks to food stamps to deal with it. Why can't you do the same thing in health care? Allow true free enterprise. How do you do it? A few quick things, and we'll get the Q&A. Allow nationwide shopping on health insurance, so you get real competition instead of a politically anointed competition. I live in New Jersey. We have nutty regulation there. I can buy virtually equivalent policy in neighboring Pennsylvania, half the price that I can in New Jersey, third of the price in Wisconsin. Yet it's illegal for me to do so. I can buy a car in Pennsylvania, a house in Wisconsin, illegal for me to buy the insurance. Why? Nationwide shopping. So if you see that gecko on TV peddling auto insurance, have them peddle some health insurance at a good price. Equal tax treatment. If businesses get a tax deduction, if you're an individual, unless you're self-employed, you don't get a deduction. Equalize it. How about real tort reform? How about removing barriers to making it easier for people to combine together to buy it? Get real competition. And people say, what about people with pre-existing conditions and the like? Well, why not start to really build on what states have but really haven't exploited yet properly, and that is high-risk pools. If you can't get it, you go in the pool. Yes, it's subsidized, but states that have high-risk pools have far lower premiums than states like New Jersey, where we mandate that you have to cover everybody. And if you allow nationwide shopping, I guarantee you're going to see companies rise up that'll do this more cheap than the current carriers today because they're wedded to the old system, where they'll offer you true catastrophic coverage, where if something bad happens to you, you are covered. They won't cover you if you need a filling, but if something bad, it's like housing insurance, homeowners insurance. If your house burns, the company then doesn't come in and say, sorry, the policy's canceled because it's past December 31st, the policy's expired. No, if it happened in December, you're covered, and you're covered until the house gets rebuilt. But yet with health insurance, if you, say, get a dread disease during the year, policy lapses at the end of the year. How crazy is that? That's not real insurance. And if you reform the system, you can get the best of all worlds. True safety nets, but true free enterprise, creating more health care at more affordable cost. So bottom line, this is the big battle over statism. If we get it right in this country, sound dollar, good tax code, put a rein on regulations and get the Constitution operating in that area again. Get real free enterprise in health care. What we're going through today will simply be a nightmare that we quickly and long-term wake up from. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. If you feel you want to go or have to go, please go. I'm of an age where I'm very sensitive to that. But raise your hand. We have two people here with microphones. And while you're thinking of questions, just let me give you one example among zillions of how regulatory agencies will always regulate more and more. EPA, the Journal had a piece the other day that the EPA has decided that they must have oil spill regulations apply to farms and ranches, and they've declared milk, as a milk spill, comes under their regulations on oil. Why? You can't make this stuff up. A percentage of animal fat, which is a non-petroleum oil, is how they define milk. So if you're at a dairy and Betsy kicks over the cow, I know they do it by machine now, but I'm trying to make a point. That means you have to have first responders. You have to have a cleanup protocol. And the Agriculture Department has several $1 million set aside, and this is an exact quote, to help farmers and ranchers comply with on-farm oil spill regulations. You can't make this stuff up, as the article says. It's amazing. Okay.
Mr. Forbes, I come from San Jose, California. And my econ teacher actually told a story about you. He said he met you in an airport, and you made time for a conversation with him and actually sent him an email afterwards. So my question for you is, do you have any tips on networking and leadership for the young people here?
Glad you asked. 2 years ago, I co-authored a book on leadership called Power, Ambition, Glory. 2% off for cash, but seriously on networking in this day and age, the fantastic thing with all the tools you have. That's why the Tea Party movement became so strong. It's also why Barack Obama won those caucuses in 2008. Where this wasn't the genius of the people running his campaign. It was people coming together through social networking that won those caucuses that Hillary Clinton ignored. So the tools are there for anyone who wants to use them, but it's very easy to do. And they still have something called libraries now. You may have noticed they have a thing called card catalogs. So in the old days, if I wanted to look something up, I have to go physically there, go through the thing, and then hope they have the bloody book in the library. And maybe 3 months later, if they don't, they might get a copy. And now you go on the internet, and more, it's instant. You can do. And I was mentioned, I co-authored a book on the economy, about to do another one. You can do research that would have taken years to do, literally now in a matter of weeks or months. It is phenomenal. So in networking, just do it. And put out there. Facebook's a nice thing. Throw it up there. Everyone has friends, and it's for like-minded folk. It's very easy, fan pages and the like, to come in contact very quickly. And so it's much easier now. And you often learn something. Now, defriending is another subject, which I'm sure they're writing books on, but we won't get into that now. And in terms of leadership, one of the things that makes for a good productive leadership, obviously, is having that sense of purpose and winning the trust of others. And also, if you desire to be a leader, recognize no matter how good you are, no matter how wise you are, no matter how energetic you are, you're going to have crises. You will make mistakes, or events will hit you in a way you hadn't anticipated. It happens. So be flexible. It's what you're here to do. You get exposed to a lot of areas. You never know when you're going to have to draw on them. And so be prepared for crises. It will happen. And if you have that mindset, you'll save yourself one heck of a lot of angst and trouble. Oh, what did I do wrong? Why didn't I foresee it? Get over it. It's going to happen.
We have time for one final question, and we would also like to inform you that Mr. Forbes will be available in the lobby signing his book, How Capitalism Will Save Us, Why Free People and Free Markets Are the Best Answer in Today's Economy.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes, very much. I understand why my father read you every day of his life. Two
wise
questions.
Father, wise daughter, yes. Thank you.
Why 100,000 as a ceiling, and why 17% instead of 10%? I'm sorry to ask more money questions, but...
No, 100,000 ceiling for?
As a need for the cap, 100 billion, I'm sorry.
And the other one was on...
Why
17%? Okay, let me do the 17% on the flat tax. I wanted to do it in a way in which no one, when we brought the system in, had a tax increase. So yes, you could lower the rate and do away with the exemptions, but a lot of people with the crazy things we've done to the code would face a tax increase, and I just don't want to get into that. So let's not let the mistakes of the past hobble us. Don't let the perfect get in the way of pretty darn good. So I would design the thing so that everyone gets a tax cut. No one gets a tax increase, so we don't get hung up politically on that. The other thing as a part of that is you have to give people a choice. When you say, people ask, you're going to do away with charitable deductions, you're going to destroy charitable institutions? You can explain, no, in the 70s when the top rate went from 70 to 28, charitable giving went up. When people have more, they give more in this country. You can go through all of that. People just focus on what they lose. It's human nature. So when you bring in the new system, give them a choice. They can go with the old system or stay with the old if they wish. If people know that if they want to keep what they have, they can, boy, the temperature goes down. Just removes a lot of political roadblocks and emotions. So you decide which one is better. Okay, let's try it. Because if I don't like it, I've got to let the steam off. So so the 17 is what it worked out as, those numbers. I probably have to update them now. In the terms of the 100 million on regulations, I picked that just because it's destructive, and I think politically it's what we can get through now as a stopgap to starting to do some real constitutional work on that. And I see that as a beginning, not as an end. Once elected representatives know that the trend line is more accountability, they're going to move away from this tendency of saying, I'll pass something that sounds nice and throw it off to somebody else, slough off the responsibility. No, if you want to go into public life, better be prepared to take on real responsibility. That's what it's about, like anything else in life. Well, as was indicated, I'll be down signing books. And let me say again, thank you for your kindness and warm welcome. Thank you, Larry, for my free dinner. Thank you.